Hi and welcome back. Let's paint some small seasonal midwinter cards, Yuletide or Christmas. Whatever midwinter season you celebrate, these cards are suitable for that. And I'm just going to be playing around with some sort of semi-abstract, sort of almost floral, but more like flowers and seed heads. And sort of that kind of effect, maybe with some snow spattered on at the end. So I'm just going to experiment and try this out and see how it looks. I'm using Prussian blue and burnt umber. Those are the only two colours I'm going to use, but I will use some white gouache and maybe some white Dr. P.H. Martin's bleedproof white ink. That's a lovely thing to finish highlights off with, or in this case for my snow at the end, hopefully. As you can see, I've attached my paper to my board with masking tape all around, and I've put it across the middle horizontally and vertically to divide my sheet into four roughly the same sort of size pieces. I'm not too worried about them being exactly the same size, and I'm going to put various shades or types of simple washes across each one, slightly different. The first two, one's very plain wash, the one on the right has got a little bit of dry brush sparkle across it, and then these lower two I'm adding a bit of the burnt umber to the Prussian blue. The top's just Prussian blue by itself. So I'm just looking for an interesting background for my loose flowers. I don't want to spend too long on these cards, especially if I'm going to be making quite a few of them. So I want to try and make them in a way that looks effective but doesn't take too long. I'm working on Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's a lovely paper. It's 100% cotton. I really like working on it, but use whatever paper you've got, whatever you prefer. My board's at an angle of about 45 degrees, so gravity will help me to paint. And it's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape. And I've made sure it's pressed down really well so that I can ensure that I get nice clean white borders for my cards. This is a clean damp brush, just using that to mop up any beads of paint or water that run down and catch. This is so they don't drip down the page or cause unsightly marks, as they will dry more unevenly with the rest. Now let's make some unsightly or sightly marks. Dip your fingers in your water jar and just flick it into the wet paint. Not too much, but just enough you can see. It's causing little deliberate blooms, which is giving me that sort of misty background. I should really have done that with the board flat, so I've laid it flat now. If the board's at an angle of 45 degrees, the little blooms will run down the page. But now they're flat, I can mix up an inky consistency mixture of both of my paints, and using a stiff bristle brush, I can spatter onto these little cards. Just building up enough spatter so that it looks interesting. It will soften back and lighten a bit as it dries, but I'm looking for this interesting background because then it's going to be much easier to put in my seed heads, my teasels, and my sort of dried winter flowers across these once it's dry. And now it's dry, you can see how pretty these backgrounds are looking already. I'm just going to take the same colours, as I said, Prussian blue and burnt umber, and I'm using various mixes of these on this Polina Bright number 1. I think it's a sort of a round or a mop brush, a synthetic one. It's a lovely brush. Just placing the brush and letting the brush do the work to make these kind of oval shapes, which I'm going to hopefully turn into seed heads of teasels, like dried decorative teasels that you often see used for Christmas decorations or Yuletide decorations, that sort of thing. So I'm just putting on just a few random shapes to look like a patch of teasels growing up together, just slanting them off very slightly upwards towards the left, so that I've got them growing at a sort of just a slight angle, not quite vertical. And I think that looks a little bit more effective if they're just tending off at a slight angle, either one, away from the vertical. Then just putting in a few with a clean damp brush, softening off in a few areas so I get soft and hard edges. Then I shall continue to work, maybe dab off any excess water where there's a little bit too much, and then moving on to a small calligraphy brush or a small round or even a rigger, then I'm going to paint in some spikes on the teasels. Now I'm really sorry, camera position, that I'm right in the way. At some point I'm going to have to see if I can sort out a new filming setup, but at the moment this is the only place that I can have the camera. So all I'm doing is, from these ovals, is using the paint that's in the oval and the fine brush and a little bit of extra paint to pull out these kind of just little random spiky lines around the sides, but mostly at the top. And then pulling out some sort of, I think they're sepals, kind of that support the teasel on the stem. These sort of curved, shaped, dried appendages. I'm not quite sure what they are, but they're very beautiful and they're a very distinctive part of the teasel. Just going to add a few more oval marks and turn those into teasels by pulling up the spiky amounts. As you can see, I'm varying up my mixtures of Prussian blue and burnt umber, and you can use, of course, any colours you want for this, any colours that you think will work in a sort of a dynamic yet subtle way. If I need to, I can just touch a tissue here and there just to give me a little bit more variety to the shading, and then maybe just put a bit of spatter on, flicking my bristle brush. I think I'm going to leave that to dry. That should be fine. And now let's move on to the next one. Again, using this small calligraphy brush or a round, as long as you've got a bit of a point on your brush. I'm just going to sort of roughly pull out these spiky shapes that look a bit like burrs from the burdock plant, these lovely dried seed heads. Well, they are and they aren't, if you know what I mean. I'm kind of basing the shape of that on them, but they're just going to have pretty long stems as well, and there's just going to be 3 of them this time. And then I'm just going to put some sort of random leaf shapes on the stems. I'm not looking for anything sort of like botanical accuracy here, just looking for decorative, slightly different ideas for each card that hopefully will look quite effective once we remove the tape, and then I can trim out the cards, leaving a slim white border, and mount them onto some card, and then write the greeting on the inside. Just flicking out for the leaves the same way as I flicked out for the seed heads. And there's the third stem, which I think just balances things up a bit. I think with these, while the paint is still wet, I'm going to now drop in a bit of white gouache, just to give them a slight sort of different look to the teasels, and that just pulls out a little bit of a frosty look to them. Once we put spattered the white on at the end, hopefully that should look nice and wintry and cheerful at the same time. I'm just starting on the third one, and I'm just going to dance the brush around to do some little tiny, like random seed and grass sort of flowers and weeds and things like that. And then I'll use my Paulina Bright to put in some lovely leaf shapes and then some stems, just randomly pulling out these shapes across this card. I think if you can do this kind of spontaneously without taking too much care, then you get much fresher sort of dancing marks that have quite a lot of spontaneity to them and actually look really effective, much more effective than if you were to sort of painstakingly try and paint little botanicals into these cards, keeping it nice and fresh and lively. You can see how using the brush to create these leaf shapes has really made this little card look quite different from the ones at the top. And you can, of course, use these ideas for any plants that you want and any colour schemes. You could change up the colour scheme and use this method for painting holly leaves with red berries, or mistletoe, ivy, laurel, anything like that could be done in this kind of way if you wanted to make things more overtly festive. Just pulling up the leaves and then putting in the fine stems that don't really join with the leaves too much. I'm not bothered about that. I'm just pulling them through in the same sort of direction. So while it's still wet, just spattering a little bit of white gouache into that, and the little white droplets will burst out and soften and cause some lovely colour effects in the wet paint. And now onto my final one. I've just mixed up whatever paint I've got in my palette, including a little bit of the white gouache, and I'm creating just lots of leafy stems. No flowers at all for this one. Leafy stems in the bluer tones, then changing back to some of the burnt umber for my stems and pulling these through at slightly different angles. Not all the same angles. Some are tending towards the left at the top, others towards the right, just until I feel it looks balanced. So most of the time I'm swapping between my small calligraphy brush and my Paulina Bright, or you could use a small squirrel mop. And now through these plain leaves, using the corner of a plastic card, or you could use a palette knife or your fingernail, pulling through the vein through these leaves, scraping back to almost back to the initial wash, and you can see that creates that leaf shape more convincingly, but still very loosely. Now let's leave that to dry completely, and then we'll come back and we'll add the snow with our white spatter. So I'm going to lay it flat, and then I'm going to take my Dr. P.H. Martin's bleedproof white ink. You could use any ink, or you could use white gouache straight from the tube, just a little bit of water added so that it spatters, and then using my bristle brush I'm going to put either as much or as little white snow effects over my loose seed heads and leaves. I'm really liking the look of that. I think it's just bringing this together and adding that sort of wintry, festive look. And when you're happy with the amount of white spatter you've got on your paintings, then leave it to dry, and then we remove the tape. I've remembered that my cross of tape went on last, so I've got to remove that first before I can remove the border. And you can see the tape has stuck down really nicely, and we've got these borders that make the cards look far more complete. You can see how that they look once they've been cut down with little borders and then stuck onto maybe a contrasting card like a grey or a navy blue. Something like that would look really nice, or even a cream card would look good. Well, I hope that was helpful, and I hope it made a little bit of a change from all the wintry scenes I've been doing recently, and has shown you the potential for turning sort of all sorts of different types of designs into festive cards or gift tags or paintings, that sort of thing. Thanks so much for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And as always, a huge amount of thanks to my wonderful patrons on Patreon who support me as an artist and who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.